Jason Allen, the Preservation's Program Bureau Chief at the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. A native of Philadelphia, he came to Oregon in 1996 to study history and archaeology at Oregon State, where he graduated with degrees in both fields in 2000. After a few years conducting archaeological, I screwed this up during my being out in the field doing archaeology. He attended Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, gaining a master's degree in historic preservation planning in 2004. Returning to Oregon, he worked in the private sector, consulting on cultural resources before joining the staff of the State Historic Preservation Office in 2012. As Chief of Preservation Programs, Mr. Allen coordinates the staff leads of the National Register, state and federal tax benefits, and survey and inventory programs to ensure alignment with and success of the statewide Historic Preservation Plan. Please put your hands together and welcome Jason Allen.
How's my sound? Good? Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending in person here at the beautiful new Ledding Library. And for those who are watching at home, thank you as well. It's my pleasure to have been invited to speak to you tonight. My name is Jason Allen, and I am the Historic Preservation Programs Bureau Chief at the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. Tonight, I'll briefly describe our office, talk a little bit about the National Register of Historic Places and what it is, what listing in the National Register means in terms of regulations, some of the opportunities listing opens up for owners of historic properties, and what the process for listing property looks like. And then I'll close by telling a brief story that takes place about 160 years ago, but that I think is instructive, and even today as we attempt to preserve the historic built environment that we've inherited. The State Historic Preservation Office resides within the Heritage Division of Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. In addition to the State Historic Preservation Office, the Heritage Division also includes the Heritage Outreach Bureau, which manages our grant programs, heritage news and other publications, our social media presence, the Oregon Main Street program, and the Historic Cemetery program, as well as organizing events and meetings such as the biennial Oregon Heritage Conference. Additionally, they are the tip of the spear when it comes to critically important job of connecting people with each other and with resources that facilitate historic preservation in action. The State Historic Preservation Office comprises the two other bureaus, including the Regulatory Compliance Bureau and the Preservation Programs Bureau. The Historic Preservation Programs Bureau houses the non-regulatory functions of the State Historic Preservation Office, including the National Register, survey and inventory, and state and federal tax incentive programs. The National Register itself was created in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act and is maintained and administered by the National Park Service. The NHPA also created the State Historic Preservation Offices in order to, among the other roles that I mentioned earlier, administer the National Register process within each state and territory. 56 years later, the number of listed properties in Oregon now exceeds 2,000 individual properties and over 150 historic districts. So what does historic listing mean? At its core, National Register listing is meant to be honorific, to recognize the historic significance of important buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts for their own sake. While some communities have elected to provide varying degrees of regulation at the state and federal level, there are no restrictions associated directly with listing in the National Register, aside from a mandatory 120-day delay on the issuance of demolition permits or permits to move a building. Although this is part of a statewide planning goal, statewide planning goal 5, it is also itself administered at the local level. You'll see that this is kind of a recurring theme, historic preservation happening at the local level. There are, however, certain benefits that become available to historic properties that are listed in the National Register, and some of these are identified here. For one, it obligates the federal government to address impacts to such properties as part of project planning, another outgrowth of the National Historic Preservation Act. In addition, a number of historic preservation-oriented grants, both public and private, use listing in the National Register as a requirement for qualification, and there are opportunities to request and obtain variances from some elements of the building code in order to preserve historic qualities of a property. And these generally do not include fire and life safety for obvious reasons. Finally, though, there are federal and state tax benefits available to owners of historic properties, both designed to incentivize preservation of historic buildings and to ensure that they stay in use. The federal government the federal program is an income tax credit designed to reduce the cost of major rehabilitation projects for income generating properties up to 20% of the total cost of the project. So, for example, a $10 million major renovation for a downtown historic property gets $2 million in income tax credits to offset the cost. The Oregon Special Assessment Program, which is designed to be available separately or to couple with the federal incentive when the qualifications of both of those programs are met, provides an alternative assessed value for properties undergoing important qualifying restoration or repair work for a period of 10 years as a means of essentially redirecting money that might otherwise be paid in property tax into preservation projects in the property. So, yeah, it did not reproduce very large. So for my friends who are eager to review the regulations associated with listing properties in the National Register, as well as those with excellent eyesight, this slide provides a flow chart indicating how the nomination process goes and the applicable state and federal regulations that provide the rules. For those of us with normal interests and less than outstanding eyesight, what follows is a brief overview and some basic information to know if you're considering nominating your property for listing. I'll add that graduate courses are offered at the University of Oregon on just this subject. And sadly, I've been given less than 10 weeks to talk. So I'll encourage everyone to visit our website to get more information. The address is on the last slide at the end of this presentation. So the process for nomination usually begins with the submission of a historic resource record, or HRR, to our office. This is when the owner transmits to our office everything that they already know about the property and some photos to help us get a sense of the building. We'll look at this information and give you some feedback, typically with a lot of hedging words like it may be eligible, or it appears like a good candidate, or something like that. Usually with some thoughts on research avenues to kind of dive down and explore. Some other buildings that have been listed to look at for guidance. Some thoughts on what the challenges might be that you might be facing when trying to get the building listed. And we hedge not because we're dealing, but only because we're dealing with incomplete information at this stage. So the idea being that, based on what we're seeing, we'll give you the best opinion that we can, and whether it makes sense to move forward at that point is yours as the property owner. If the challenges appear significant, we will communicate that to you so you can decide whether to take it on or not. So when you send an HRR, what is the SHPO looking for? When it comes to eligibility for listing in the National Register, when you boil it all down, there are two primary considerations. First, is it a historically important place? Specifically, is it significant? And that word is a word that is in the regulations, and it is an important word. Just being old is not enough. It must be the place where something important happened, or it must well represent a broader trend that shaped our history, be the best reflection of a person of historical impact, or have its own historically important architectural, engineering, or artistic merits. What you've already discovered about the place may suggest to us potentially valuable areas of research to explore. The second thing we're looking at is the property itself, specifically what we call its integrity. We're looking for alterations that may have been made since the time that the property attained its significance. Depending on why the building is important, there may be some variability in terms of the standards for integrity, but overall, the building really should be well recognizable with few alterations since its historical significance was reached. If a building has had significant changes and faces challenges based on integrity, we might recommend some restoration before moving forward with the nomination. Note that these are all judgment calls, not science. This is how it goes. In historic preservation, there's no formulas or if-thens. It's all subjective decision-making. And this is why we have the extensive review processes, which is what I'll discuss next. But first, a few points that I want to make up front. Anyone may write a National Register nomination themselves. There's no required qualifications or degrees, but it is a highly specialized document with very particular requirements established by the National Park Service. And I appreciate the councilor mentioning the National Park Service is perhaps not something that everyone thinks of immediately, but they really are the core of American historic preservation. Most of the functions at the federal level happen at the National Park Service, and they provide us with most of the guidance that we use. But our office will assist you if you choose to take on writing a nomination yourself. But if you've never written one before, it may involve a fair amount of back and forth between us. As long as you keep at it, we'll be there with you. But we can't do more than give you feedback and suggestions. Sadly, we don't have the staff to write nominations. Some states do. Our office doesn't. We generally have one National Register Program Coordinator, a gentleman named Robert Olguin, who is not available to give this discussion tonight, so I'm giving it in his stead. But he will be happy to hear from anyone that contacts him, and he will assist you. But second, because of the length of the process, which can take a year or more sometimes, often less, but sometimes more, it can become tedious, especially when we're trying to really hit the fine points that the National Park Service wants us to hit. We have very specific expectations for these documents. Narratives go in a certain order. Arguments for significance must fit into specifically defined realms, and they require a lot of table setting by establishing historic contexts. Those historical storylines into which your property will fit. Here I'll mention that there are professionals who specialize in preparing these documents, and largely this is all why. The more familiar you are with the idiosyncrasies of this process, the easier and faster a nomination gets completed. And finally, as I said, it does take time to get through the process, and a fair amount of that time is waiting. If you're in a hurry, start early. Very briefly, because again, I could spend quite a long time talking about all of this, specifically about how to prepare a nomination. These are the parts of the nomination. Here you see the first page of the Federal 10900 nomination form. There are 11 sections to the National Register nomination form, the most intensive of which are sections 7 and 8. Section 7 is the narrative description of the property. This is the thorough and complete and often lengthy description of the property. Familiarity with architectural terminology is pretty important here. It includes not just the house, for example, but also the overall property, outbuildings, landscaping, etc. Section 8 is the narrative statement of significance. This is where the challenge lies for many people taking on nominations themselves, in that we must first understand the historic contexts within which the property is significant. So, for example, let's imagine a Queen Anne style home that was the residence and offices of a pioneering physician of the 19th century. In this scenario, we may be nominating the building both for its architecture and also as the place most closely associated with this important individual. Section 8 of that nomination must establish the history and characteristics of the Queen Anne style of architecture and describe how this building is an especially good example. There must be a comparative analysis that demonstrates the merits of this building against others of its type. We must then establish the significance of the doctor. This also involves a comparative analysis against other prominent physicians of the time so that we can demonstrate that she was at least among the top in her field. Then we establish the significance of her work. What were the conditions before? What was the nature of her pioneering work? And what was the lasting impact on medicine? Once we've established all that, we must also demonstrate that this is the place most closely associated with her contribution to the profession. Now, not all nominations are that complicated, but I mention this as just an illustration of the sometimes kind of achingly academic nature of these documents. It just is what it is. So now the review process that I mentioned earlier. The review process is spelled out in both federal and state regulations and rules, and we may not vary from those regulations. This is especially true of the waiting periods. These are only really waiting periods for the preparers. There are reviews taking place in the background in our office, for example, and with local historic landmarks commissions. And this is why these periods are described in the rule. The first review is the staff review. This is the back and forth between the preparer and the National Register staff at our office. There are 3 entry points for submitting a draft in March, in July, and in November. This review takes as long as it takes to get a draft that's ready for the next step, review by the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation. The State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation is a 9-member body of governor appointees, leaders, and accomplished professionals in their fields related to cultural resources, historians, archaeologists, architectural historians, etc. Between finishing the final draft of the nomination and the hearing by the SACHP, there's a 70-day waiting period, during which the nomination is reviewed by the SACHP members privately and by the local Historic Landmarks Commission for their comments. That period is as long as it is because those bodies typically meet only once a month, and sometimes it takes 2 of those meetings in order to get onto the agenda for that committee. So once the nomination reaches the SACHP, they'll present their thoughts, advice, concerns, and discuss the nomination at the hearing, a public meeting that preparers often attend and provide feedback, suggestions, and a recommendation to the State Historic Preservation Officer. Preparers may also provide testimony and answer questions from the committee. Let's assume that all that went well, and they recommend that it be forwarded to the Park Service for listing, with a couple of small changes that they recommend making. Following the meeting, the preparer and staff will make final revisions based on the committee's comments and pass the nomination on to the State Historic Preservation Officer. In our state, it's the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer who runs the Heritage Division. This person is Chrissy Curran, and she will review the nomination and recommendation of the SACHP and then make her own recommendation to the National Park Service. This review period is generally 90 days, though it can be accelerated under certain circumstances. Let's assume that Chrissy agrees with the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation and recommends that the National Park Service lists the property. The final step is the National Park Service's National Register review staff. These are professionals whose job is solely to review National Register nominations against the standards and expectations of the National Register program. Their review period is 45 days. At the end of that period, the property is either listed in the National Register of Historic Places or the nomination is returned for a revision, and on very, very rare times, it's rejected by the National Park Service. Very rarely does that happen. We usually have a sense that something like that is going to happen early on, and we don't want to waste anybody's time, so we'll try to veer off into a different direction if we sense that something like that's going to happen. So, assuming that all goes according to plan, the property then gets listed. As you can see here, a lot of time is invested in the in the process, and no small part of that is waiting for key dates and to arrive and review periods to pass. As I mentioned before, listing does open a number of benefit opportunities to owners, and so it can be a necessary step toward taking advantage of those benefits. But I'll also say, really, the listing itself is meant to be its own reward, which is official recognition that this place is indeed historically special. Now, I've described a lengthy process and possibly intimidating, but I want to be clear that our office is here to assist you or the professional preparer that you've hired to get through this process. This is one of our primary functions, and we take it very seriously. We will not leave anyone out to dry or leave them in the lurch in the middle of a process. The review process is collegial. The people involved at all levels, I promise you, are very friendly and helpful and supportive, and are all there in the spirit of public service from the beginning to the end. In addition, I can tell you that once it's all completed, the sense of accomplishment is pretty great. So now, for the story that I promised, history, after all, is about stories that resonate with us as communities and that tell us about who we are and where we've come from and the events that brought us to this point. A word of warning, there is much legend around these events, and it's difficult to separate fact from inspirational fiction concerning the details. However, the central truth of the story is not debated. I'll point that part out at the end, a message that I hope that you'll take away from my brief time with you here. So the story takes place at a time of sectional factionalism when tensions were very high and the greatest national trauma in our history was on the horizon only a few years into the future. The country faced splitting itself apart, and the national experiment appeared to be at risk. In the mid-19th century, historic preservation in the United States as we know it today begins. It was then that the first effort to faithfully preserve an important historical building was undertaken for the sake of serving as an important reminder of our shared history for the benefit of the people of the country. This is Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, as it appeared at the time our story begins. At this point, the building is already nearly 100 years old. After George Washington's death in 1799 and that of his wife Martha in 1802, Mount Vernon passed to the son of Washington's younger brother, John Augustine Washington, and then through successive generations of that family. By 1855, about the time this photo was taken, the property had come to Washington's great-grandnephew, John Augustine Washington III. In the decades prior to his inheritance, the family fortunes had declined dramatically to the point that the property could no longer really be maintained, as you can see by the sagging roof line there on the porch, the scabbed-in supports, missing pillars, and deterioration of what looks like a stone facade, but is actually wood carved to look like stone. The buildings and property were indeed in a sad, sad state. Perhaps recognizing the building as potentially symbolic of a moment in history that bound the sections together, John Augustine sought to save the building for all Americans as a symbol of national unity, and to that end, to make sure that it would be open to the public in remembrance of the first president, whom for many embodied the central thesis of the Republic. John Augustine offered to sell it to the federal government for $200,000, a third less than he'd been offered by a private owner, or by a private purchaser. For reference, that's the equivalent of about $7.5 million today. The truth of his motivation may be more legend than truth. The same argument is put in the mouths of others in our story, so take that such as it may or may not be. Regardless, when Congress declined, which seems hard to believe today, he made the same offer to the state of Virginia, which incredibly also declined, possibly because he was committed to finding a way of keeping it open to the public and not just becoming the private residence of another person, or possibly because he was implored to do so by his wife at the urging of one or more possible buyer. He put off accepting the offer from the private purchaser until he had spoken to the next star of our story. According to the most popular version of this story, one night in 1853, while passing by on a steamer on the Potomac River, Louisa Cunningham found herself stunned and horrified to witness the condition of the property, which looked very much like it did in the photo that I had up earlier. It sits prominently on a hill above the river, and you can see it as you go by, headed towards Washington. She was so distressed that she wrote to her adult daughter, Anne, lamenting the shame of it, that this place, sacred to our country, should be left to decay, suggesting that if the men of the country weren't willing, then maybe it should be the women of the nation to save it. Anne Cunningham, moved and inspired by her mother's letter, was compelled to begin an effort to save and restore the building for the people of the country. Driven, she formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1853 and immediately got to work, organizing an extensive nationwide barnstorming and letter writing campaign to raise money and public support for the property, or for the purchase and restoration of the property, with the goal of opening it to the public. At the first meeting held at Cunningham's home, they raised $293.75, which is a long way from $200,000. As Ms. Cunningham was from a well-to-do South Carolina family, the initial effort was taken on by Southern women, but at the insistence of Ms. Cunningham, the effort was widened to all women, both North and South. A very controversial move. The sectional mistrust was high and threatened to destroy the effort in the cradle. Anne and her supporters continued to stress the ability of the effort, Anne and her supporters continued to stress the ability of the effort to transcend these divisions. Nevertheless, opposition continued, carried by high-profile celebrities on both sides, threatening to completely undo the effort. No less a leading figure than Elizabeth Cady Stanton was vocally opposed, as were many notable abolitionists and Northern politicians. Southerners felt ownership over Washington as a Virginian, refused to cooperate with the Northerners, but nevertheless she persisted. It's worth noting here that as the effort began to gain traction and the organization began to realize some early successes, John Augustine III withdrew the property from the sale agreement, reportedly out of a wounded ego, and the belief that women would mismanage the property. Anne Cunningham spent the next 2 years, so the story goes, and believably enough, nursing his pride and reassuring him until the property was finally secured by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1858. There is much more to the story, and the time here is short, so I'll skip to the end and make my point. Faced with what must at times have seemed like insurmountable obstacles, including skepticism, ridicule rooted in sexism, and the devastating sectionalism that would shortly sink the country into the brutal Civil War, the home of the first citizen of the United States, as Washington was sometimes called, was achieved through the persistence and dogged determination of a group of people that recognized its importance. The effort to save Mount Vernon was ultimately successful, and the property has been preserved and open to the public ever since. Faithful restoration of the property began the very next year, and new discoveries made since that time have continued to guide further restorations. This is my son and I in the lower right here just 3 years ago. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, incidentally, continues to own and operate Mount Vernon today, operating completely on private contributions. I relate this story because the message, I think, is clear, and it is this: historic preservation, like many efforts, is seldom successful without the visionary leadership of a dedicated champion and the support of a broad coalition of the public. Historic preservation was not at that time, and is not always now, a priority for government. Despite the recognition over the last 55 years that historic preservation is in the interest of the nation and state, evidenced by the existence of the State Historic Preservation Office, it is and has always been through the dedication and action of private individuals and groups creating a critical mass of support that the preservation of important places is finally achieved. And with that, I'll wrap up my presentation. Here's our website address. There's tons of good information there, including the Historic Sites database, which I encourage everyone to poke around in. With about 70,000 entries in it, there's a lot of Oregon's built heritage to see, and more of it's getting added all of the time. Please also visit our website, which covers everything the SHPO does, and many, many helpful links. And finally, most of all, I want to encourage everyone to get involved in whatever way makes sense for you in the long-term preservation of Oregon's built history. The properties we have today are the gift that came to us from those who came before, and let us also, in turn, give that gift to those of us who come after us. Thank you all very much.